A monk once walked into his master's room and found him laughing. Not a nervous laugh. Not the laugh of someone trying to hide his fear. A deep, rolling, chest-shaking laugh. "Master," the student said, "you are dying." The master looked up, wiped a tear from his eye, still grinning, and said, "I know. Isn't it wonderful? The question nobody wants to ask. What if death is not the problem? We spend our entire lives making one enormous assumption. That death is the enemy. That it must be delayed, denied, medicated, eulogized, and above all, never discussed over dinner. We build hospitals to push it back. We build religions to explain it away. We build distractions, phones, careers, Netflix queues, to make sure we never have to sit quietly long enough to feel it approaching. And yet, the Zen masters, those strange, luminous, often deeply inconvenient human beings, did the opposite. They walked toward death. They practiced it daily. They invited it into their meditation cushions the way you might invite a long-expected guest. And when death finally arrived, and it always does, they greeted it not with screaming, not with bargaining, not with the desperate clinging that you and I have rehearsed our entire lives. They greeted it with a poem, or a joke, or a smile so wide it unnerved the people standing in the room watching them go. Why? That is the question this reflection exists to answer. Not philosophically, not academically, practically. Because if the Zen masters found something on the other side of their fear, something real, something alive, something worth dying for, then maybe, just maybe, the way we're currently living is missing something important. Let's go find out what that is. Take a slow breath with me right now. In through the nose. Hold. And out. Good. Because this is not a lecture about death. This is a conversation with life. And the only way to have it honestly is to let death sit in the room with us right here, right now as we speak. The Zen tradition has a word, shoji. It means birth and death together, as one inseparable movement. Not birth then death. Not life interrupted by death. Birth and death. One hyphenated reality. One continuous river. Most spiritual traditions separate them. Zen refuses to. And that refusal, that stubborn insistence on looking at the whole picture, is where everything interesting begins. The masters who laughed at the edge. 3 men who changed the meaning of dying. Let me introduce you to 3 people. Their names may be unfamiliar, but what they did at the end of their lives will stay with you. The first is Ikkyu. Born in 1394, possibly the illegitimate son of a Japanese emperor, Ikkyu Sojin was the most scandalous Zen monk who ever lived. He drank sake in taverns. He fell deeply in love. He wrote erotic poetry. He refused to wear the robes of authority. He burned his own certification as an enlightened master, literally set it on fire, because he believed the institution had become more interested in prestige than in truth. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person most religious organizations desperately wanted to get rid of. And yet he is now considered one of the greatest Zen masters in Japanese history. When Ikkyu was dying, he was in his 80s by then, having outlived almost everyone he loved. A student came to him and asked the question students always ask, "Master, do you have any final wisdom for us?" Ikkyu smiled. "Attention," he said. The student waited. Surely there was more. "Attention," Ikkyu said again. More waiting. Silence. "Master, is that it?" Attention. 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 And then he died. Sit with that for a moment. A man who had spent 80 years reading, writing, meditating, loving, scandalizing, and searching. And his final word, his summation of everything he'd learned, was a single instruction. Pay attention. Not to death. Not to enlightenment. To this. Right now. Whatever is here. Ikkyu didn't die because he was afraid. He died because he was paying attention to dying. There's a difference. The second master is Ryokan. Where Ikkyu was fire, Ryokan was water. He lived in a tiny hut on a mountain, almost entirely alone. He gave away everything he owned. He played with children in the village below, rolling balls and flying kites with the same reverence he brought to meditation. He once returned home to find a thief in his hut, stealing his few possessions. He felt sorry for the thief. There was so little to take. He took off his robe and offered it to the man as a gift. The thief ran away, bewildered. Ryokan looked up at the moon above his empty hut and wrote. The thief left it behind, the moon in the window. When Ryokan was dying, he was asked if he had any final teachings. He paused, and then quietly he said, Namu Amida Butsu, which is a simple Buddhist prayer, a surrender, an act of pure trust, not a system, not a philosophy, not a 5-step guide to enlightenment. Just trust. Let go. The moon is still there. The third master is Hakuin. Hakuin Ekaku was the man who essentially revived Rinzai Zen in Japan during the 18th century. He was a volcanic teacher, intense, demanding, deeply compassionate, and famous for designing some of the most puzzling koans in the tradition. He worked himself nearly to death in his 20s through obsessive meditation practice. He nearly lost his mind. He recovered, barely, through a combination of guidance from a mountain hermit and a radical technique called Nikken, a kind of inner visualization that used the body itself as a meditative object. He came back from that edge changed. And what changed in him was this. He stopped treating the body as an obstacle to enlightenment. He began teaching that this flesh, this breath, this ordinary human life, not somewhere beyond it, was where awakening lived. When Hakuin died at the age of 83, witnesses said he was calm. Not grimly calm. Not stoically calm. Luminously calm. Like a lamp burning without fuel. Like something that had already let go long before it died. 3 masters. 3 different personalities. 3 different approaches to practice. One shared quality at the end. No fear. Not the absence of fear because they'd suppressed it. Not the absence of fear because they'd convinced themselves of some comforting story. The absence of fear because they had, through years of practice, looked directly at the thing that frightens us most, and found that it was not what they had assumed. The illusion at the center of everything. Who, exactly, is afraid of dying? Here is the question that Zen has been asking for 1500 years. And it sounds simple until you really try to answer it. Who are you? Not your name. Names are labels attached to whatever you are. Not your job. Jobs are stories we tell about our activity. Not your body. The body changes every moment. Cells dying, cells being born, atoms borrowed from food and air and water, constantly cycling back to where they came from. Not your thoughts. Thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds. You can watch them from a distance. If you were your thoughts, who would be doing the watching? Not your memories. Memories are edited reconstructions. Every time you remember something, you change it. Not your personality. Personality is a pattern of habitual responses, built from conditioning, from early wounds, from culture and accident. It can change. It does change. It has changed in you already, probably more than you realize. So, who is afraid of dying? Zen does not answer this question by telling you the answer. It answers it by making you find out for yourself. That's what koans are for. That's what sitting in silence is for. That's what the shouted HO of the Rinzai teacher, the unexpected slap of the Kyosuke stick, the absurdist non-answer to every reasonable question. All of that is designed to do one thing. Break the story you are telling about who you are, just for a moment, just long enough for you to see what's underneath the story. And what's underneath the story? The Zen masters say, nothing. But, and this is the crucial point, not nothing like emptiness or void or absence. Nothing like spaciousness. Like the sky that holds all weather without being any particular weather. Like the silence that makes music possible. Like the zero in mathematics, not an absence of value but the condition that gives all value its meaning. In Zen, this nothing has a name. Sunyata in Sanskrit, or in Japanese, ku. And the discovery of this nothing, this groundless ground, this open awareness that underlies all experience, is what the masters were pointing to when they smiled at death. Because if you are not the story you've been telling about yourself, if you are not the accumulation of memories and preferences and wounds and achievements and fears, if you are, at the deepest level, more like the sky than like any particular cloud, then what exactly is dying? The body dies. Yes. The story ends. Yes. The role you've been playing, the name on the gravestone, that concludes its performance. But the sky doesn't die when the clouds clear. The silence doesn't die when the music ends. And the awareness that has been quietly watching your entire life, all of it, every moment, that has never been born so it cannot die. Now, I want to be careful here. This is not a claim that your soul goes somewhere nice after you die. Zen is suspicious of such claims. Not dismissive, suspicious. The tradition says, we don't actually know what happens after death. Any teacher who tells you with certainty is selling you something. What Zen does say, and what you can verify in your own experience right now, is that the self you take yourself to be is far more fluid, far less solid, and far more mysterious than the story you've been living inside. That is verifiable. That you can check. Sit quietly for 10 minutes. Watch your thoughts arise and dissolve. Watch the gap between them. Ask yourself, sincerely, who is watching? See what you find. The practice of dying before you die. Every breath is a small resurrection. There is a phrase attributed to various Sufi and Zen sources. Die before you die, and you will not die when you die. On the surface, this sounds like a riddle. Sit with it longer and it becomes a map. What does it mean to die before you die? In Zen, it means the practice of letting go while you're still here. Every meditation session is a small rehearsal. You sit down. You let go of your name. You let go of your to-do list. You let go of the identity you've been performing all day. You let go of your plans for the future and your resentments about the past. You release everything you are gripping, and you discover what's left. What's left is not nothing. What's left is the simple, bare, luminous fact of being here. Present. Awake. Before any label has been attached. This is what Zen calls mushin, no mind. Not mindlessness, but mind before categorization. Mind before judgment. Mind in its original, unconditioned state. The Japanese Zen tradition takes this practice of dying very seriously. In some Rinzai monasteries, monks perform a ritual called shigo, death practice, where they meditate on the process of dying in vivid detail. They imagine their body failing, their breath stopping, their consciousness releasing from everything familiar. Not to become morbid, not to cultivate depression or hopelessness, but to discover, through direct experience, not through theory, that even in the imagining of death something remains. Something watches. Something continues to be aware even as it imagines the end of the person doing the watching. That something is what they're after. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition takes this even further with practices like the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is literally a guide to navigating the moments of dying and the transition beyond it, read aloud to the dying person or to the dead themselves. But even in the Zen tradition, which is generally suspicious of elaborate metaphysics, the core practice is the same. Learn now what it feels like to let everything go. Learn it when the stakes are lower. Learn it on the cushion, in the silence, in the small daily deaths of releasing your grip on being right, being seen, being important, so that when the final letting go comes, and it will, you have some experience of what lies on the other side of the clench. There is a traditional Zen exercise that I want to offer you now. You can do it right where you are. Right now. Eyes open or closed. Simply ask yourself this question. What would remain of this moment if I removed my opinion about it? Not what would remain if you felt differently about it. Not if you reframed it. What would remain if you removed the one doing the opining, the one with the name and the preferences and the history, entirely? What's left? Just this sound. Just this breath. Just this texture of light and shadow and the quiet hum of everything. That is what the masters were pointing at when they died smiling. Not a heaven. Not a reward. Just this, seen clearly for maybe the first time, stripped of the overlay of anxiety and grasping. The death poem, Japan's most profound tradition. When you have 30 seconds left, what do you say? In Japanese Zen culture, there is a tradition called the Jisei, the death poem. For centuries, it was considered the final act of a mature spiritual life, to compose, in the last days or hours of one's existence, a poem that captured something essential about what you had learned. Not a summary. Not a farewell. A distillation. The way a river distills a mountain range into a single valley of water. Here is the death poem of Bosway Takusho, a 14th century master. Do not be deceived. Look directly. What is this? That's it. 3 lines. A lifetime of practice, poured into 3 lines and then released. Here is the death poem of Kozan Ichikyo, a Zen monk who died in 1360. Empty-handed I entered the world. Barefoot I leave it. My coming, my going. 2 simple happenings that got entangled. Here is the death poem of Shui, who died in 1791. The snow which falls today, how many places will it lie? I want you to notice something about these poems. None of them are desperate. None of them are bitter. None of them are congratulating the author on a life well lived, or lamenting the things left undone, or expressing fear about what comes next. They are all looking outward, toward the world, toward something larger than the person dying. Snow falling, hands empty, a direct question, what is this? That is not a question seeking an answer, but a question dissolving into wonder. The death poem tradition tells us something profound about what these practitioners had internalized. When you truly know, not just intellectually but in your bones, that the self is not a fixed thing, that it is more like a wave than a rock, then death is not amputation. Death is the wave returning to the ocean. And from the ocean's perspective, the ocean was always there. Nothing was lost. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you had to write a death poem right now, if you had 3 lines or 30 seconds to point at what this life has been, what it has meant, what remains essential, what would you say? Don't answer out loud. Don't even answer in words, necessarily. Just sit with the question for a moment, because the question itself is the practice. Why we fear death. The terror has a texture and a purpose. Let's be honest about something. Everything we've explored so far is beautiful, and it might also feel, if you're in a certain mood, deeply unreachable. Like something meant for masters on mountains, not for people with mortgages and difficult relationships and a body that gets tired and scared and sick. So let's talk about fear directly, because Zen does not pretend fear doesn't exist. The fear of death is perhaps the oldest human emotion. Evolutionary psychologists tell us it's baked into our neurological architecture. The amygdala lights up in response to death cues the way it lights up in response to predators, because for most of human history, death cues were predator cues. The fear kept us alive. But we are the only animal, as far as we know, that can imagine our own death in advance. We can sit in a comfortable room, physically safe, and feel the terror of extinction. We can lie awake at 3 in the morning, healthy and uninjured, and feel our hearts pound with the anticipation of an ending that may be decades away. This is the gift and the burden of human consciousness. We can think ourselves into fears that our body cannot distinguish from real threats. Ernest Becker, in his brilliant and disturbing book The Denial of Death, argued that almost everything humans do is ultimately a response to this primal terror. Our ambition, an attempt to leave a legacy that outlasts us. Our relationships, an attempt to merge with something larger than our isolated selves. Our religion, an attempt to believe that the story continues after the final page. Our wars, because if my group survives, something of me survives, and the fear is momentarily quieted. Even our drive to accumulate, to consume, to fill our homes and our hours with things and distractions. Becker suggests this is, at its core, a way of not thinking about the one thing that can't be fixed. Zen takes this terror seriously, not by offering a comforting alternative narrative, but by asking, look at the fear itself. What shape does it take? What does it feel like in the body? Where does it live? If you sit with the fear of death, not running from it, not arguing with it, not replacing it with something pleasanter, just sitting with it, feeling it, something interesting happens. It begins to change. Not because you've conquered it, but because you've stopped feeding it with avoidance. Fear is, in large part, the anticipation of what we have not yet faced. When we actually face the thing or the possibility of the thing, the fear does not necessarily disappear, but it changes its quality. It becomes less of a prison and more of a signal, a pointer. Here the fear says, here is where you are holding on too tightly. Here is where you are mistaking your story for your life. Here is where you could let go. There is a practice in Zen that is sometimes called sitting with the great question. The great question is not, what happens after death? That question is unanswerable, at least for now. The great question is, who is this that dies? Who is the one you are so committed to protecting? Explore that question. Not aggressively, gently, like pressing your tongue against a sore tooth, just enough to feel where the tenderness actually lives. You may find, as the masters found, that the one you are protecting is less solid than you thought. That the self you're so afraid of losing is already, in every moment, being released and reformed. That you have been dying and being born hundreds of times today alone. Each thought rising and dissolving, each moment of experience arriving and departing, each breath a small birth and a small death and another breath. And in the middle of all that coming and going, something still, something that doesn't move. That stillness is your actual address. Living differently because of this. What death teaches about how to be alive. Enough philosophy. Let's talk about what this actually changes. In your life. In your Tuesday. The masters didn't smile at death because they had figured out some cosmic loophole. They smiled because their relationship with life had changed. When you practice the reality of impermanence, really practice it, not just nod at it as a concept, everything becomes more vivid. This conversation becomes important. This particular quality of light through a window becomes unrepeatable. This person sitting across from you, who you've seen 1,000 times and mostly look through, suddenly you actually see them. Because you know now in your body and not just your mind that this is happening exactly once. There will not be another version of this morning. In the Zen tradition, there's an aesthetic concept called mono no aware, which translates roughly as the pathos of things. It describes the bittersweet awareness that comes from truly perceiving impermanence. The falling cherry blossom is beautiful because it falls. The sunset is worth watching because it ends. The moment with a person you love is precious because it is not guaranteed. Mono no aware is not sadness. It's a kind of lucid tenderness, a seeing of things as they are, which happens to be more beautiful and more fragile and more alive than the half-sleeping numbness we ordinarily walk around in. The Zen masters practiced this lucidity consciously. They kept death close not because they were morbid, but because proximity to death made everything else cleaner. There's a story of a student who asked a master, "What happens after enlightenment?" The master said, "Chop wood, carry water." And before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The same activities, but they become completely different when you are fully present to them. When you are not somewhere else in your mind, grinding through the chopping while fantasizing about being done, while worrying about tomorrow, while regretting yesterday. Just chop, just carry, just this. What would that look like in your life? What if, just today, not forever, just today, you treated each conversation as if it might be the last one you have with that person? Not dramatically, not morbidly, not by announcing, "I'm treating this as our last conversation." Please don't do that, it's alarming. But internally, what if you listened a little more fully, judged a little less quickly, put down the phone, just this once, and actually looked at the person across the table? What if you ate your meal tasting it, instead of consuming it while scrolling? What if you walked from your car to your front door noticing the temperature of the air, the color of the sky, the sound of the neighborhood, instead of constructing your next sentence? This is what the masters practiced. Not dramatic rituals, not hours of philosophy, just the persistent, gentle, revolutionary act of being here, dying daily to the habit of being somewhere else, and out of that dying, a life, possibly the first real life you've ever had, the final teaching, the smile that remains, what the masters knew that we have forgotten. We come back at the end to the question we began with. Why do Zen masters die smiling? I want to offer you not one answer but several. Not as a list, as a chord. Multiple notes sounding at once. They smile because they are not surprised. The masters have been practicing this moment for decades. They have sat with death in meditation, met it in koans, taught about it, written about it, faced it in others, allowed it to visit their own bodies in illness and exhaustion and the slow surrender of age. When it finally arrives, it is not a stranger. It is, in a strange way, an old friend. You smile when an old friend arrives. They smile because they are no longer holding on. By the end of a deep Zen practice, the habit of grasping, the white-knuckle grip on being right, being seen, being permanent, being safe, has been, over years of practice, gradually loosened. Not perfectly. The masters are not superhuman. But enough. Enough that when the final letting go comes, they are already familiar with the posture. They have rehearsed it in 1,000 small ways. And now the grand version arrives, and they discover what they always knew, deep down, was there. It is okay to let go. It was always okay. They smile because they have found what cannot die. This is the most difficult thing to express and the most important. Not because it requires complex language, but because it points at something that language was never designed to carry. The awareness that underlies your life right now, the simple, silent fact that you are here experiencing this, that awareness has no edges. It was not born when you were born. It will not die when you die. This is not a metaphysical claim. It is not a promise about heaven or rebirth. It is an observation available to you right now in direct experience. The awareness that is aware of this moment has always been here. Before you had a name. Before you had a body. Before you had a story. There was awareness. And when the body ends and the story concludes and the name dissolves, the tradition points to the possibility that awareness does not dissolve with them, that it simply returns to itself, the wave meeting the ocean, the river returning to the sea. And they smile finally because the smile is the practice itself. Ikkyu laughed in the tavern and the temple alike. Ryokan flew kites with children 3 days before he died. Hakuin, lying on his deathbed, is said to have made a joke so good that the monk beside him burst out laughing. The smile is not a performance of peace. The smile is what happens when the performance has finally stopped, when you no longer need to be anything other than what you are, when the elaborate architecture of self-protection and self-promotion and self-maintenance, all that exhausting, expensive, lifelong construction project, can finally, mercifully, rest. The smile is rest. The smile is the face of someone who is no longer fighting the river. The smile is what you look like when you have stopped insisting that reality should be different from what it is. I want to end this reflection not with a summary. I want to end this reflection not with a summary. I want to end it with a question. The same question the masters never stop asking, the question that has no answer except the one your life becomes over time. Right now, in this moment, before you move or speak or scroll to the next thing. What is here? Not what should be here. Not what you wish were here. What is actually already undeniably here? Sit with that, for as long as you can stand it, and then a little longer. Because on the other side of the discomfort, something is waiting, something that has always been waiting, something that will still be here when the waiting ends. The masters died smiling because they had already found what you are looking for, and what they found was not somewhere else. It was not behind the next achievement or beyond the next spiritual breakthrough. It was here. It was always here. In the pause between 2 breaths, in the space between 2 thoughts, in the quiet that holds all of this, the words, the listening, the life, the death, without being moved, without being afraid. Pay attention. The moon is still there.